Wealthy white man insults homeless black man, learns a shocking lesson about humility. Richard Harrington's polished leather shoes strike the pavement with staccato precision as he marches down the bustling city street. His jaw clenches, a vein pulsing at his temple. The failed business deal churns in his mind, each step fueling his frustration. He weaves through the crowd, his tailored suit an armor of success among the sea of mediocrity. But today, that armor feels hollow. The Westbrook contract was supposed to be his crowning achievement, cementing Harrington Enterprises as the undisputed leader in their field. Now, it slipped through his fingers like sand. As he approaches his office building, its gleaming facade mocking his failure, Richard spots a figure hunched on the sidewalk. The sight of the disheveled man holding a cardboard sign ignites a fresh wave of irritation. Veteran in need, the sign proclaims in messy scrawl. Richard's lip curls. He's built his empire on hard work and ruthless determination. The idea that someone would beg rather than pull themselves up by their bootstraps offends everything he stands for. Without breaking stride, he sneers down at the man. "Get a job, you worthless beggar," he spits, voice dripping with disdain. He expects the usual response: anger, shame, or pathetic groveling. Instead, the man looks up, meeting Richard's gaze with calm, steady eyes. "Life can turn on a dime, friend," he says quietly. "You never know where you'll end up." The unexpected response catches Richard off guard. For a split second, doubt flickers in his mind. But he quickly shoves it aside, rage building in its place. "You don't know anything about me," Richard snaps, taking a menacing step closer. His voice rises, drawing the attention of nearby pedestrians. "How dare you lecture me, you filthy—" "Hey, let's calm down," a woman's voice cuts through his tirade. A young woman with kind eyes steps between them, her posture non-threatening but firm. "There's no need for this." Richard's nostrils flare. "This is none of your business," he snarls, waving her off dismissively. The woman, Jessica, her name tag reads, stands her ground. "I volunteer at the shelter," she explains, nodding towards the homeless man. "I know Mark. He's a good person who's fallen on hard times. There's no need for insults." Her words only stoke Richard's fury. The day's frustrations coalesce into a white-hot ball of rage. Without thinking, he shoves Mark hard. The older man stumbles backward, falling heavily to the ground. Gasps erupt from the growing crowd of onlookers. Jessica rushes to help Mark up, shooting Richard a look of shocked disbelief. For a moment, Richard feels a surge of vicious satisfaction. But as Mark steadies himself, leaning on Jessica for support, he looks directly at Richard. "Your father wouldn't have wanted this," Mark says quietly. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He staggers back, mind reeling. "What? How do you know my father?" Mark's eyes hold a hint of sadness. "We served together," he says simply. "He saved my life once. I never thought his son would treat a veteran this way." The revelation shatters Richard's world. His father, the man he's idolized, the standard he's held himself to, knew this homeless man? Impossible. And yet, a memory surfaces. His father, speaking of an old war buddy he'd lost touch with. A man named Mark. "You're lying," Richard growls. But the words lack conviction. Jessica's eyes widen as she notices something glinting beneath Mark's coat. "Are those dog tags?" Mark nods, pulling out the metal tags. 25 years in the Marines," he says. "Decorated combat veteran." The crowd murmurs, the tide of opinion shifting palpably. Richard feels the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. His carefully constructed image of superiority crumbles, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. Richard's heart pounds against his chest, his mind reeling from Mark's unexpected revelation. He forces a dismissive laugh, but it sounds hollow even to his own ears. "You don't know what you're talking about," he says, struggling to maintain his composure. Jessica, The young volunteer senses the shift in the air. Her eyes lock onto Mark, urging him gently, "Tell us what happened." Mark's weathered face softens, his gaze distant as he begins to recount a tale that shakes Richard to his core. "It was during the Battle of Fallujah," Mark starts, his voice low but steady. "Your father's unit was pinned down by heavy enemy fire." Richard feels the crowd lean in, their collective breath held as Mark's story unfolds. He describes the chaos of the battlefield, the acrid smell of gunpowder, the deafening roar of explosions. Richard's father, then a young lieutenant, had been separated from his team. "I saw him there, alone and exposed," Mark continues. "The enemy was closing in. I knew I had to act." As Mark recounts his daring rescue, Richard's mind races. His father had always been tight-lipped about his military service, but there had been hints, vague references to a comrade who'd saved his life. Richard had dismissed them as exaggerations, never imagining they'd come back to haunt him like this. "We made it out," Mark concludes, his eyes refocusing on Richard. "Your father got a Purple Heart. I got this." He taps his leg, and Richard notices for the first time the slight stiffness in Mark's gait. A cold sweat breaks out on Richard's brow. He tries to mask his unease with a stern expression, but he feels exposed, vulnerable. The crowd around them has grown, and Richard can sense their mood shifting. Sympathetic murmurs ripple through the onlookers, punctuated by disapproving glances thrown his way. Richard's entire worldview teeters on the edge of collapse. His life has been built on the bedrock of his own superiority, his wealth, his power, his unshakable rightness. But now, faced with the man who saved his father's life, a man he'd carelessly insulted and shoved to the ground, Richard feels that foundation crumbling beneath his feet. The pressure of the crowd's judgment weighs on him. Some faces show anger, others disappointment. Richard, always so in control, finds himself floundering. He opens his mouth to speak, but no words come out. Mark continues his story, describing his struggles after returning home. "The nightmares were the worst," he says quietly. "And then, trying to find work, it was like the skills that kept me alive over there meant nothing back here." Suddenly, a gasp cuts through the murmurs. A woman steps forward from the crowd, her eyes wide with recognition. "I remember you," she says, her voice trembling with emotion. "You were in the newspaper a few years ago, a veteran who couldn't find a job, despite all you did for this country." The woman's words trigger a cascade of recognition. More voices join in, piecing together Mark's identity. "I saw that story too," someone else calls out. "It was a disgrace how they treated you." "War hero," another voice says, the words rippling through the crowd. "Decorated veteran." Richard watches in growing dismay as the tide of public opinion swells unmistakably in Mark's favor. The pity and disdain that had colored their initial reactions to the homeless man have transformed into respect and admiration. Each nod of recognition, each murmured word of support, feels like another nail in the coffin of Richard's pride. He can no longer dismiss Mark's story as a fabrication. The evidence is mounting, undeniable. Richard's mind floods with conflicting emotions, guilt for his actions, shame at his arrogance, and a desperate, clinging need to salvage some shred of his dignity. But as the crowd's support for Mark grows, Richard feels himself being painted ever more clearly as the villain of this impromptu street drama. His carefully cultivated image of the successful, magnanimous businessman is crumbling before his eyes. The pressure builds, a crushing weight on Richard's chest. He can't bear it any longer. "Enough of this," he shouts, his voice cracking with strain. He shoves his way through the crowd, desperate to escape, to find some quiet place where he can gather his thoughts and regain control. But the crowd, now fully aligned with Mark, closes ranks around him. A burly man grabs Richard's arm, his grip firm. "You can't just walk away from this," the man growls. Others join in, their voices rising in a cacophony of demands. Listen to him. You owe him an apology. Face what you've done. Richard struggles against their hold, panic rising in his throat. He's never felt so powerless, so utterly out of control. His usual tactics, intimidation, dismissal, the sheer force of his personality, are useless here. These people, ordinary citizens he would have ignored on any other day, have become a force he can't reckon with. A scuffle breaks out as Richard tries to break free. Hands grab at his expensive suit, voices rise in anger. Richard's world narrows to a blur of faces and grasping hands. He's no longer the respected CEO, the man whose very presence commands respect. Here, in this moment, he's just a man being forced to face the consequences of his actions. Just as the situation threatens to spiral into chaos, a new voice cuts through the din. I know who you are, it says, calm but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. The crowd falls silent, parting to reveal an older man. His face is lined with age, but his posture is ramrod straight, hinting at a military past. He steps forward, his eyes moving from Mark to Richard. I served with both of them, the man says, his voice heavy with memory. Mark and your father. Richard feels the fight drain out of him, replaced by a creeping dread. The old man's gaze is piercing, filled with disappointment that cuts Richard to the quick. Your father spoke of you often, the man continues, addressing Richard directly. He was so proud of you, always bragging about his brilliant son. He pauses, the weight of unspoken judgment hanging in the air. But he also spoke of Mark, said he was the bravest man he knew, the kind of man you could trust with your life. The words hit Richard like physical blows. Each one strips away another layer of his defenses, leaving him raw and exposed. He thinks of his father, the man he's always strived to impress, to surpass. How many times had Richard dismissed his father's old war stories as irrelevant to the cutthroat world of business? But now, faced with the living embodiment of those stories, Richard is forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. He hasn't just insulted a stranger today. He's betrayed the very values his father held dear. The realization crashes over Richard in a wave of shame. His carefully constructed world, built on the bedrock of his own superiority, lies in ruins around him. He's left standing amid the wreckage, faced with the stark reality of his own arrogance and the consequences of his actions. The crowd watches in tense silence, waiting to see how Richard will respond. But for once in his life, Richard Harrington, CEO, Harvard MBA, master of the boardroom, is at a complete loss for words. Richard's world crumbles around him as Samuel's words echo through the tense air. The older man's eyes, clouded with memories, bore into Richard's soul. After the war, your father tried to find Mark, Samuel says, his gravelly voice heavy with regret. But the chaos of post-war life made it difficult. He searched for years, but eventually lost track of him. Each word hammers another nail into Richard's coffin of guilt. The weight of his father's unfulfilled promise settles on his shoulders, threatening to crush him. The expectant silence of the crowd presses in, suffocating him with their unspoken demands. Richard's mind races, desperately grasping for a lifeline. His father, the man he's idolized his entire life, had failed Mark too. The realization hits him like a punch to the gut. He'd always seen his father as infallible, a paragon of success and integrity. Now, that image shatters, leaving Richard adrift in a sea of uncertainty. The crowd's eyes bore into him, their collective gaze a silent accusation. Richard feels the walls closing in, both physically and emotionally. Time seems to stretch and compress simultaneously, each second an eternity of judgment. Sweat beads on Richard's forehead as he searches for a way out. His privileged mind latches onto the most obvious solution: throw money at the problem. I'll help you, he blurts out, his voice cracking with desperation and a hint of determination. I'll take you to a shelter. Make sure you get what you need. The words leave a bitter taste in his mouth, even as he says them. It's a band-aid on a bullet wound, and he knows it. But it's all he can think of in the moment, his panicked brain grasping at straws. Jessica, standing nearby, immediately senses the inadequacy of Richard's proposal. Her eyes narrow, disappointment etched across her face. A shelter isn't enough, she says firmly, her voice cutting through Richard's flimsy offer. Mark needs something real, something permanent. The crowd murmurs in agreement, a soft rumble of discontent that sends shivers down Richard's spine. He realizes with stark clarity that if he truly wants to atone for his actions, he must go beyond a quick fix. This isn't a problem he can solve by writing a check or making a phone call. Jessica's gaze softens slightly as she sees the realization dawning in Richard's eyes. What Mark needs is a home, she continues, her voice gentler now, and a job, something that will give him the stability and dignity he deserves. Richard swallows hard, his throat suddenly dry. The magnitude of what Jessica is suggesting hits him like a freight train. It's not just about today, or tomorrow, or next week. It's about fundamentally changing a man's life, and by extension, his own. He nods slowly, the reluctance evident in every line of his body. But beneath the fear and uncertainty, there's a glimmer of something else. Hope, perhaps. A chance at redemption. A way to right the wrongs of both the past and the present. Taking a deep breath, Richard turns to Mark. The homeless man's weathered face is impassive, giving nothing away. Richard licks his lips nervously, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. Mark, he begins, his voice wavering slightly. I'd like to help, not just with a shelter, but with a home and a job. Something permanent, like Jessica said. The words hang in the air, fragile as spun glass. For a moment, Richard dares to hope that this will be enough, that his offer will be accepted and this nightmare will end. But Mark's eyes narrow, his jaw clenching. When he speaks, his voice is cold enough to freeze the summer air around them. I don't want your charity, Mark says, each word precise and cutting. Not from someone who looks down on me. The crowd holds its collective breath, the tension ratcheting up another notch. Richard, taken aback by the vehemence in Mark's voice, stumbles over his words. But, I'm trying to help, he protests weakly. I want to make things right. Mark's laugh is bitter, devoid of any real humor. Make things right? He repeats incredulously. You think throwing money at me will erase what you've done? What you've said? Richard feels his face flush with shame and frustration. He doesn't understand why Mark won't accept his help. In his world, money solves everything. But here, in this moment, he's realizing that there are some things money can't buy. Then what do you want? Richard demands, his own temper flaring. I'm offering you a chance to get off the streets, to have a real life again. Why won't you take it? Mark's eyes flash dangerously. Because I'm not a problem for you to solve, Mr. Harrington. I'm a human being. And until you can see me as one, until you can look at me without that disgust in your eyes, your help means nothing. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He staggers back, the truth of Mark's statement cutting through his defenses. For the first time, Richard truly sees the man standing before him, not as a homeless vagrant, not as a charity case, but as a person with dignity, with pride, with a story that Richard has never bothered to consider. The realization breaks something inside Richard. The carefully constructed walls of his privileged worldview come crashing down, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. Tears spring to his eyes, unbidden and unwelcome. I'm sorry, Richard chokes out, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been wrong. So wrong. Not just today, but for so long. The admission costs him dearly, each word dragged from the depths of his soul. But as they leave his lips, Richard feels something shift inside him. A weight lifts, replaced by a crushing sense of responsibility. The crowd watches in stunned silence as Richard Harrington, titan of industry and pillar of high society, breaks down before their eyes. It's a moment of raw humanity, stripping away the veneer of wealth and status to reveal the flawed, struggling man beneath. Just as Richard begins to believe he's making progress, finally addressing his own faults and offering sincere help, Mark delivers a final, devastating revelation. "Your father never lost track of me," Mark says quietly, but the words cut through the air like a knife. "We've been in contact all these years. He knew where I was, knew my situation, but he didn't know how to reach out to you." The crowd falls into stunned silence, and Richard's world tilts on its axis. The revelation shatters any remaining illusions he had about his relationship with his father and the values he thought they shared. Richard's mind reels, unable to process this new information. His father, the man he spent his entire life trying to emulate, to impress, has known about Mark's struggles all along and never said a word? That can't be true, Richard stammers, his voice barely audible. "My father would have told me. He would have done something." Mark's eyes soften slightly, a flicker of pity crossing his weathered features. "Your father is a complicated man, Richard. He wanted to help, but he didn't know how to bridge the gap between us and your world. He was afraid of disappointing you, I think." The irony of that statement is not lost on Richard. All his life, he's been afraid of disappointing his father. And now, he learns that his father has been equally afraid of disappointing him. This revelation completely upends Richard's understanding of his own family. The emotional distance that has always existed between father and son suddenly takes on new meaning. Richard realizes that his relationship with his father, which he always considered a pillar of his identity, is far more complex and fractured than he ever imagined. The weight of this realization, coupled with the events of the day, proves too much for Richard to bear. His legs give out beneath him, and he stumbles back, barely catching himself against a nearby wall. The crowd, sensing his inner turmoil, remains silent, giving Richard the space to process the bombshell that has just been dropped. Richard's mind races as he tries to piece together the fragments of his life that have now been shattered. Images flash through his mind. His father's proud smile at his business successes, the distant look in his eyes during family dinners, the way he always seemed to be searching for something more. Richard had always attributed it to his father's drive for success. Now, he wonders if it was guilt that haunted the older man's eyes. Finally, unable to hold back any longer, Richard slides down the wall, his knees hitting the pavement hard. Tears stream down his face, unchecked and unashamed. "I didn't know," Richard chokes out, his voice raw with emotion. "I didn't know how much I've lost, how much I've failed." The admission hangs in the air, a testament to Richard's complete vulnerability. The crowd, which had been so critical of him earlier, now watches in stunned silence. They see him not as a villain, but as a deeply flawed man struggling to come to terms with his own failings. Mark steps forward, his expression unreadable. He kneels down beside Richard, his presence both a comfort and a rebuke. "It's not too late," Mark says softly, "to make things right, to be better." Richard looks up, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate. "How?" he asks, the single word carrying the weight of a lifetime of mistakes. Mark doesn't answer immediately. Instead, he holds out his hand, the same hand Richard had sneered at earlier. Now, it represents a lifeline, a chance at redemption. After a moment's hesitation, Richard takes it. Over the following weeks, Richard throws himself into making amends with a fervor that surprises even himself. His first step is to reach out to Jessica, the volunteer from the shelter. She's understandably wary at first, but Richard's sincerity eventually wins her over. Under Jessica's guidance, Richard starts volunteering at the shelter. The work is grueling and often heartbreaking, a far cry from the cushy boardrooms he's used to. But with each passing day, Richard feels a little piece of his old self chip away, replaced by something new and unfamiliar. He meets other veterans, listens to their stories, and for the first time in his life, truly hears them. The weight of their experiences humbles him, making his own problems seem trivial in comparison. Richard finds himself staying late at the shelter, offering not just his time but his full attention and empathy. One evening, as Richard helps serve dinner at the shelter, he catches sight of his reflection in a tarnished serving tray. The man staring back at him is almost unrecognizable. Hair mussed, suit replaced by a stained apron, hands rough from manual labor. But his eyes are alive in a way they haven't been in years. Richard's efforts extend beyond the shelter. He reaches out to his father's old military contacts, seeking to understand more about the veterans' community and their needs. He attends support group meetings, not as a speaker or figurehead, but as a silent observer, there to listen and learn. His actions are met with cautious optimism from the community. There are still those who eye him with suspicion, waiting for the mask to slip and reveal the old Richard. But as days turn into weeks and his commitment remains unwavering, even the skeptics begin to soften. One particularly challenging day at the shelter, Richard finds himself face to face with a young veteran who reminds him painfully of himself at that age. Arrogant, entitled, angry at the world. The interaction leaves Richard shaken, forcing him to confront the person he used to be. That night, he sits alone in his penthouse, surrounded by the trappings of wealth that once seemed so important. Now, they feel hollow, meaningless compared to the connections he's forged at the shelter. For the first time, Richard truly understands the emptiness of his former life. As the weeks pass, Richard's reputation slowly begins to rebuild. Not as a wealthy businessman or powerful CEO, but as someone who genuinely cares and is willing to put in the work to make a difference. It's a different kind of respect than he's used to, but he finds it infinitely more satisfying. One quiet afternoon, as Richard is helping Jessica sort through donations at the shelter, she pulls him aside. Her expression is serious, and Richard feels a flicker of anxiety. Has he done something wrong? Is his presence no longer welcome? Richard, Jessica begins, her voice low. There's something you need to know. Richard braces himself, expecting the worst, but nothing could have prepared him for what comes next. Mark was aware of who you were from the start, Jessica reveals. He and your father, they planned this encounter. It was meant to be a lesson. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He stumbles back, gripping the edge of a nearby table for support. What? He manages to choke out. Jessica's eyes are sympathetic but firm. Mark knew exactly who you were and what you represented. This whole situation, it was a test. A way to force you to confront your own behavior and beliefs. Richard's mind reels. Every interaction, every word exchanged with Mark takes on new meaning. He'd thought he was in control, that his journey of redemption was his own choice. But all along, he'd been a pawn in a larger game. Why? Richard asks, his voice barely above a whisper. Why go to such lengths? Jessica's expression softens. Because your father saw what you were becoming, Richard. He saw how far you'd strayed from the values he tried to instill in you. This was his way of trying to reach you, to show you what really matters in life. The revelation leaves Richard speechless. He thinks back to his father, to the strained relationship they've had in recent years. How many times had his father tried to talk to him, only to be brushed off or ignored? As the shock begins to wear off, Richard is surprised to find that he's not angry. Instead, he feels a profound sense of gratitude. This elaborate plan, this test of character, it's given him a chance to become the man he always should have been. Weeks pass, and Richard continues his work at the shelter, his commitment unwavering despite the revelation. The knowledge that his journey was orchestrated doesn't diminish its impact. If anything, it deepens his resolve to prove himself worthy of the lesson. Finally, after what feels like both an eternity and no time at all, Richard receives a message from Mark. A time and place for a meeting, nothing more. Richard's heart races as he reads it, knowing that this could be his final test. The appointed day arrives, and Richard finds himself in a quiet park, away from the bustle of the city. Mark is already there, seated on a bench, his posture relaxed but alert. As Richard approaches, he feels the weight of the past weeks, of every choice that has led him to this moment. "Mr. Harrington," Mark greets him, his voice neutral. "Please," Richard says, "call me Richard." Mark nods, gesturing for Richard to sit. For a moment, they sit in silence, the tension between them now replaced by a newfound understanding. "I know about the plan," Richard says finally. "About you and my father." Mark doesn't seem surprised. He simply nods, his eyes never leaving Richard's face. "And how do you feel about that?" he asks. Richard takes a deep breath, considering his answer carefully. "Grateful," he says finally. "I was lost, Mark. So lost in my own ego and self-importance that I couldn't see what I was becoming. All of this, it opened my eyes." A small smile tugs at the corner of Mark's mouth. "That was the hope," he admits. Richard shakes his head, still amazed at the intricacy of the plan. "I see now that wealth means nothing without compassion," he says softly. "All those years chasing success, and I never realized what true richness really is." Mark nods, a knowing glint in his eye. "Sometimes," he says, his voice gentle but firm, "the richest lessons come from the poorest places." The words hit Richard with the force of revelation. He looks out over the park, seeing it with new eyes. The carefully manicured lawns and expensive landscaping fade away, replaced by the faces of those he's met at the shelter. Each one a story, each one a lesson in humanity. "Thank you," Richard says, turning back to Mark, "for not giving up on me, for giving me the chance to learn this lesson." Mark's smile widens slightly. "The lesson was always there, Richard. You just needed to be ready to learn it." As they sit there, sharing a moment of mutual respect and understanding, Richard feels a profound sense of peace. The journey isn't over. He knows he has a lifetime of learning and growth ahead of him. But for the first time, he feels like he's on the right path. The sun begins to set, casting a warm glow over the park. Richard and Mark stand, ready to go their separate ways. But before they part, Mark extends his hand. Richard takes it, the handshake a symbol of the bridge they've built between two worlds. As Richard walks away, he feels lighter than he has in years. The weight of expectations, of constant competition and self-aggrandizement, has lifted. In its place is a new sense of purpose, a commitment to using his resources and influence for the betterment of others. He knows the road ahead won't be easy. Old habits die hard, and there will be times when he'll be tempted to fall back into his old ways. But now, armed with the lessons he's learned and the connections he's made, Richard is ready to face those challenges. For the first time in his life, Richard Harrington understands what it truly means to be rich.